Dr. Jonathan Clark. Dr. Clark, as you know, is, most of you know, is the medical chief officer for the Inspiration Mars project that you have been working so hard during the last 2 semesters. So the bio of Dr. Clark is probably 30 or 40 pages long. It may take me like an hour and a half to go through it. So we have here just a short page. I'll try to summarize. Right now, Dr. Clark is an associate professor of neurology and space medicine at the Baylor College and teaches operational space medicine at the Center for Space Medicine. Too many medicines in just one sentence. He's a space medicine advisor for the National Space Biomedical Research Institute in Houston. He's a clinical assistant professor at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, where he teaches at the aerospace medicine residency. He received a bachelor's in science from Texas A&M and a medical and an MD from the Uniformed Service University of the Health Sciences, and is a board certified in neurology and aerospace medicine. Dr. Clark is a fellow of the Aerospace Medical Association. He was a member of the NASA Spacecraft Survival Integrated Investigation Team from 2004 to 2007, and a member of the NASA Constellation Program, EVA Systems, from 2007 to 2010. Dr. Clark worked at NASA from 1997 to 2005 and was a space shuttle crew surgeon on 6 shuttle missions, as well as chief of the medical operations branch. He devoted 26 years of active service with the U.S. Navy, during which he headed the Spatial Orientation Systems Department at the Naval Aerospace Medical Research Laboratory in Pensacola, the Aeromedical Department at the Marine Aviation Weapons and Tactics Squadron 1 in Yuma, Arizona, the Neurology Division and Hyperbaric Medicine at the Naval Aerospace Medical Institute. He was also a Department of Defense Space Shuttle Support Flight Surgeon, covering 2 space shuttle flights and flew combat medical evacuation missions in Operation Desert Storm with the U.S. Marine Corps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He qualified as a Naval Flight Officer, Naval Flight Surgeon, Navy Diver, U.S. Army Parachutist, and Special Forces Military Freefall Parachutist. He was a Chief Medical Officer for Excalibur Almas, an orbital commercial space company from 2007 to 2012, and since 2013 he is the Chief Medical Officer for Inspiration Mars Foundation. Dr. Clark was Medical Director of the Red Bull Stratos project. You may remember with the Felix Baumgartner jumping out of the stratosphere, making the highest stratospheric freefall parachute jump from 127,852 feet. His professional interests focus on the neurologic effects of extreme environments and crew survival in space. And it's a pleasure, it's an honor to have here Dr. Jonathan Clark.
Thanks a lot, Pablo. It's an honor to be here. I've always wanted to get up here, and it's just through a variety of reasons I haven't been able to get up here for a while, but I've followed very closely the work that Pablo and the human space part has been doing on spacesuits, because I've done a lot of work in spacesuit operations, both at NASA and also in the commercial sector. And we bumped into each other at Ames at the centrifuge, and he was doing some stuff, and I said, hey, I've been doing a lot of work out here too, so if you need any help with certifying the suits on the centrifuge, that's something I could help you out with. So he'd asked me, you know, based on the capstone projects that were ongoing, that if I'd talk on Inspiration Mars, and I said, boy, you know, I'd love to. It's too bad having sat through these great the presentations today, that I wasn't able to give these guys a little bit of insight into some of the things that we had on this project. But I'll tell you a little bit about it, because it's a fascinating opportunity for partnership between industry, academia, and government, and it has a potential for success. And I was really captivated by the innovativeness of the student projects this morning and some of the ideas they had on how to optimize success with various modalities. And I'm looking forward to actually taking the presentations they did and taking it back to Dennis Tito, who's the head of the Inspiration Mars Foundation, and Tabor McCallum and others, so they can look at some of these ideas. In fact, even while we were sitting there, Pablo was getting emails from them because I had sent copies of the presentation the day before to some of the folks, so they're very excited about it. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit different than what we had this morning, which was more about the mission architecture and some of the trade studies. Mine's going to talk about the human black box. And the reality is that humans that operate in the aerospace and space environments are another black box that you have to contend with. And it's probably the black box that has the highest failure rates. If you think about mean time between failure for aircraft systems, you know, like critical structures, it's 1 in a million, 1 in 100 million operations. You know, the failure rates for humans is in the 1 in 100. I mean, that's what we consider that as an acceptable risk. That's why you have the cardiovascular risk for the FAA is about a 1 in 100 chance of a fatal cardiac event while flying in a year. And you would never accept that in the context of a hard system, an aircraft or spacecraft systems. So what I'll talk to you about is this program, which is really, almost a bridge too far. It's a very lofty goal, and it has a chance of success, but everything has to hit just right. And I'll talk about the human part of it. You can go to the website, inspirationmars.org. It's a nonprofit organization that's funded primarily by Dennis Tito, who's an interesting character. He was a trajectory flight controller at JPL in the 60s, and he developed some of the algorithms on orbital mechanics that we are actually using today. And he took some of his analytical skills and he applied them in business and made a ton of money, and then took some of that money and bought the first ticket on the Soyuz as a space tourist, much to the chagrin of NASA. And he's a real character. And a lot of the goals have to do with the very thing that we're here for, and it's to inspire the next generation of scientists and engineer, technical folks. We really need that in this country. And this, I was so proud to hear that the capstone projects dealt with his Inspiration Mars, because we had no idea how much it really touched American academia. So again, I applaud your efforts, and I've gone through your presentation. I look forward to reading the articles. And by the way, if you're interested, I'll send you the architecture document that was developed, a 600-page document on some of the things that you were discussing, but now with a little bit more insight. Much of it was derived with input from NASA at all the different centers, as well as space companies like Boeing and Lockheed Martin. So the thing that drove this, on this chart here, you have in this axis in time of flight in years, and here's 1 year, 1.5, 2 years, and in this axis on the x-axis are years, and this is 2017, 2012, and what you see there is these orbital mechanic renditions that showed the time of flight to go to Mars and back. And what you see here are these recurring themes that, on a regular basis you can get there and back in 3 years, but every so often, say every 15 years, you have a little dot here that's half that time, 1.5 years. And so that article that came out in Journal of Spacecraft and Rockets in the late 90s was what inspired Dennis to go back and look at this and come up with this concept that we could do a Mars flyby mission. A mission that would be similar to the Apollo 8 mission, a proof of concept to test systems out, getting there and back. obviously we've got a lot more issues to contend with. It's a lot further. The energy to get out of the Earth's gravity and get to Mars is quite extensive. It's a long time in transit. And we'll talk a little bit about humans have spent this period of time in space, not in one episode, but cumulatively. And it's a long trip. And then you've got a fairly extensive reentry force to contend with. The normal shuttle reentry or low Earth orbit reentries are about 8 kilometers a second. The Apollo missions were 11. Starduster, I think, was in the high 12 range, and 14 kilometers coming back from Mars. 14 kilometers a second is a pretty fast reentry speed, and all the thermal constraints. So there was a huge group of people that got together over the course of the last year and had these technical interchange meetings and went over all the things that we discussed today in your talks. And so, if you'd like, I can provide some of that insight to you. Well, one of the things that came up right from the get-go, and the faculty was, what's the deal? 2018. The maturity of the systems, the launch system, the transit module, the propulsion to get the trans-Mars injection, all those things were, are you kidding me, 2018? We don't have the momentum that we had in Apollo, or the money, or the national resolve. So 2018 really was a bridge too far. So really, literally, just in the last couple of months, they found an alternate path. So instead of a 500-day mission to do a Mars flyby, they have a new mission architecture that I'll talk about, which would give us another 3+ years and give us a longer mission. We talked about what do you trade when you don't hit that optimal time. It's about a 3-month longer mission, but you have more time to get there. You have less launch energy, and you have less reentry energy. And the only price you pay is now you've got 3 more months to deal with en route. And instead of launching kind of at the nadir of solar activity, now you're launching when it's starting to come back up again. And that's a potential issue, but it's always going to be an issue. So here's a rendition of this using the satellite toolkit, analytical graphics, and all this I'll make available to you all if you'd like. Leaving the end of November of 2021, you see the Earth in the blue circle. The green is the trajectory of the Inspiration Mars mission. And what you're going to see here is the first thing you get as a freebie is you get a flyby now by Venus. So you get a 2-for-1. You get, instead of just a flyby of Mars, you also get a flyby of Venus, which you can see here, which is occurring about 5 months later. So you're going to get a transit closer to the sun. Got a lot of issues that contend with there with respect to solar storms, etc. But here's a rendition of what it would look like to go by Venus in April, 4 months after, or 5 months after after launch. So now you have something else to do as part of the science payload. Now you see. After the Venus flyby, you're going to see this green trajectory approach Mars in the late October time frame. So this is a much more eccentric orbit than the one that was planned for 2018. So here you see the flyby coming in here around October. Late October, right there. So here we see the flyby going by again. It's on the dark side of the moon. There's constraints there, but there might be imaging capabilities with some of the vision enhancement technologies as well as other spectral astronomy payloads. And there was some great discussion on some of the science payloads today. I really thought the idea of capturing dust from one of the Mars moons would be a value. And then you see the return mission. And the other thing is, what you see here is this orbit of the blue orbit of Earth. You can see that even though you've done a Mars flyby, you're still fairly close to Earth in a large part of that. So it's going to enhance the comms capabilities. And we talked about whether you need a TDRA satellite or not. Probably not. But you do have to have a concern about some of the solar weather monitoring systems. And here you see the rendezvous coming up here with Earth in the latter part, or the mid part of 2023. So some of the things that the drivers were, we were going to use primarily U.S. systems. The idea of using a couple, I'm not sure who thought of that, whether it was Dennis Tito or it was Tabor McCallum and his wife, who run Paragon, a life support company, who were also on the 2-year Biosphere 2 mission several years ago. But the rationale is that by being an intimate couple, you would be able to tolerate the invasion of your personal space a little bit better. And there's some rationale for it. If you look back in the historic records, there have been severe conflicts with crew, fights. There's even, I've got a tape of a Russian psychologist talking about a crew member that wanted to kill his other crew member. Now that's not to say that that couldn't happen with an intimate couple, but you'd hope that if you volunteered for this, you would be okay with that. Because mass and spacecraft size are key drivers, you're going to see here that this is an extremely small habitable volume per crew. This is really pretty constrained. It would be like a Winnebago-size system for 590 days, and then back, landing on water. There was a lot of trade analysis on the launch system. You've got to get a pretty large mass to orbit, over 20 metric tons to Mars, trans-Mars injection orbit, and you have to have a large delta V. So the drivers of a lot of mass and a lot of delta V in the trade study actually quickly eliminated a lot of the contenders that were discussed today. Falcon Heavy could only get about half the mass, so you need a couple of those, and it's pretty far along in its, or pretty far away from being developed. The United Launch Alliance systems, despite the rocket engine problem that might occur with the Russians, is doable again, but you would need at least 3 of those launches, and those launches increase your potential for failure. So ultimately what happened in a discussion with the NASA folks who were under a Space Act agreement was that your best option was a Space Launch System. Again, it's also a relatively immature system, but it has the capability with a launch to get the up mass and the delta V to get to Mars. And some of that has to do with the up mass, and some of it has to do with the escape velocity. One of the problems that you have with the Falcon system is the specific impulse for the LOX kerosene versus the LOX hydrogen. So that was a driver in that discussion, and I'm not an expert at it, but if those of you are very interested in it, I can give you the trade studies that were involved in there, and they're quite extensive. But the bottom line is that the Space Launch System was the primary system to get the majority of the mass and the delta V you needed. Early on, there was this idea that you could do a Falcon 9 or a Falcon Heavy, Dragon capsule, and an inflatable module. And so that was kind of like the first draft, and this is what actually was on the original Inspiration Mars poster. But the analysis on the, again, the launch system precluded the Falcon system. And then the analysis of the pressurized volume versus the cargo and the habitable volume quickly reduced the utility of using an inflatable system. And that, again, if you're interested in some of that more detail, I can provide that for you. So this kind of the version 2 was, hey, we're a little worried about launching crew with a large mass. That was something that came out of the Columbia mission, is that you separate crew from payload. So our second version of this was to have the Space Launch System go up there, take all the transit vehicles into low Earth orbit, and then launch the crew on the winner of the commercial crew program. The problem with this became apparent was that, well, you know, we need a re-entry system, and that hasn't been developed. We need an upper stage trans-Mars injection. That wasn't developed. And we would have to take a cargo module that's in development by Orbital Sciences, the Cygnus module, and put them together in a configuration that wasn't hasn't been tested very much. So you had a lot of low technology readiness level capabilities. These were the three contenders. The decision has not been made as to what would be the vehicle, but that again was in development. And then the real challenge was that they were going to have to develop a new reentry capsule de novo that had never been done before. And so that was Rev 2. And then literally within the last 4 to 6 months, the new current architecture, I won't say the final architecture, has now to put everything back together on the Space Launch System, but this time take the Orion capsule with its launch abort system to protect the crew in case of vehicle breakup on ascent, and put it back with all of the transit module parts. And now instead of using an Orbital Science Cygnus module, they're going to use a well-tested module, which is the multi-purpose logistics module that's built by ESA and is flown to the space station as a replenishment module. And what they did is they took a docking port and they hardened and shielded a module. It's called the Leonardo Permanent Multi-Purpose Module, the LPMM, which has already been in space for 2 years now and done just fine. And then use the Space Launch System upper stage that's in development as the trans-Mars injection. So this one is kind of mid-TRL, this is high TRL, and this is low TRL. But it's less of the lower TRLs as it was than the second one. And the only problem is that you'd have to do a docking with the Orion capsule in space. So I'll just show you some of the things here. Here's the Space Launch System. Here's the trans-Mars injection dual-use upper stage. Here's the multi-purpose module, the permanent multi-purpose module based on the ESA design. And here's the Orion with its launch abort tower that's fairly well along in the process of development. So we went from a 1 launch system to 2, back to 1, and then changed a lot to the highest TRL systems that we had available. The permanent multi-purpose module is flown in space for over 2 years. The Orion capsule is in its launch test phase. The only one that's probably a lower TRL is the dual-use upper stage. And then the volumes and the habitable volume and transit module are appropriate. This is the one that's probably the lowest TRL system of all. It's the dual-use upper stage. Here, the vehicle's launched. The launch escape system, the launch abort system, aeroshell has been jettisoned here. The solar arrays are deployed. The fairing is on, and then the fairing is jettisoned. The Orion capsule detaches and then comes back around and then docks with the permanent multi-purpose module. And then they make the Trans-Mars injection burn. On their way, once everything is secure, the Trans-Mars, the propulsion module is jettisoned. And there was a lot of discussion about, don't you want to keep it? Maybe there's some value in having that extra deorbit capability, or delta V capability. But the decision was that you still have the service module from the Orion. So a lot of these things that you all had done in your capstone project were very relevant. You just didn't have the most current information or some of the trade studies that had gone into that. So this is the version 3 of the Inspiration Mars mission. Push the date back a little bit longer, use more reliable or more tested systems. Here's the artist rendition of the Venus flyby, the Mars flyby, and once you get back into the proximity of Earth, you jettison the HAB module, which will burn up, and then the vehicle does its deorbit burn and then jettisons the service module. And then you end up with just the capsule coming in. Now this capsule can hold a 6-person crew, so it's got a lot more volume than you need for the people involved. But the thing is, we were going with the highest TRL systems that were available and would provide the capabilities needed to do this mission. And then there were a lot of other, these are just show you some of the trade studies. You guys, I'm sure, would benefit from looking at this, but you know, a launch abort system, no launch abort system, single vehicle or multiple vehicles, and how you'd break that out. The habitat module, whether you do a rigid or inflatable or a combination of those two. So what you want to do when you do a trade study is start with all the options available to you and narrow them down based on, you know, principles and driving assumptions. The service module and the HAB module went through various iterations, and now it looks like it's going to be the module that is used by ESA. Now that's the one non-US system, but it's a well-tested and perhaps the most flight-tested system out there. I won't go through too much of this because I want to get to the medical stuff, which is the gist of my talk, but there was a lot of analysis that went into the total pressurized volume and habitable volume, and then what would be the utility of having an inflatable vehicle. And the rationale for avoiding or not jumping into an inflatable module was the fact that you had so much gear on board that an inflatable module only gave you a little more than 1/3 of the extra volume that you could use. And again, it's not a flight-tested system. We had some discussions about that today, too. Would be nice to know that, but other than a couple of the Bigelow modules that have flown, you know, as small-scale mock-ups, there hasn't been a lot of experience with that, especially with respect to debris hits, deterioration in various, you know, in the space environment, things like that. And again, for those of you that would like the more detailed part of the analysis, I can give you that to you. This is an interesting graph of spacecraft volume versus mission duration in log scale. And this is volume in meters cubed per person. And you can remember the single-person capsules, the Vostok, Voskhod, and Mercury, you know, one crew for a couple of days. And then as you see this log scale go up there, you can see it's about 1 day, 1 cubic meter, 10 days, 10 cubic meters, 100 days, 100 cubic meters in volume. Well, you can't go and do that forever, especially with a 500-day mission now means that you are, you know, you're right here. And that's 500 cubic meters. And we're talking about, you know, 2 orders of magnitude less than that. So what you see here is that after about 100 days, you start seeing that tapering off. And this is a curve that came out of some of the NASA architecture studies. You know, you have the green curve is like, it should be the red curve. It's like the barely tolerable curve. And then the red curve is, kind of performance is acceptable, and then the blue curve is what you do for space tourists. That's the best case scenario. But again, because you're going so far, so long, and taking so much stuff with you, you're going to go with the bare minimum approach. And there's a really interesting NASA trade study, mostly for planetary stuff, on going with these minimal habitable volumes. So we're going back to the the VW, the Yugo, the real small, the Mini Cooper style car in space exploration. So for my part, what I had to do was to pull together a team and provide the medical part, or cover the human black box side of things. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we did that. And I'll bring in a new area of medicine that's actually in mainstream medicine in selected areas, personalized medicine, radiation protection, crew selection training, countermeasures, diagnostics, and then some of the various science projects that are available to you. So here we go. A couple of things that are driving this. And this was the same case whether it's Apollo 8 going to the moon or back. This is a free return trajectory, so we're not carrying enough propellant to say stop, we're coming back. And we're doing a fast free return trajectory, which means we're going to try to do the shortest time that you can get there and back. But abort to Earth is an option. So that means if something bad happens, when we talked about the risk analysis part was brought up today in some of these trade studies, is you are going to have to accept that if you have a critical mission failure, like loss of habitable volume or loss of pressurized volume, fire, toxic atmosphere, things like that, that there's a possibility without carrying enough redundant consumables that you're going to not make it. And that's something that the crew would have to understand, the mission planners and all those people would say that there are going to be scenarios where failure is the only option, unfortunately. So our part of it's going to be, what do we do to try to optimize that to the best degree we can? And the way we do that is, you go into this knowing with, this essentially informed consent how bad this situation is with respect to systems failures en route and some of the constraints, particularly radiation, that we're going to have to face. We want to get the crew in as best shape as possible. This is something that NASA does extensively, particularly with respect to physical and psychological conditioning. And I'll talk a little bit about this personalized medicine program. This has now become mainstay in cancer therapy. They can do a genetic analysis and say, this drug is going to work for you, this drug won't work for you. And a lot of the variability that we have in treating patients has to do with basically population studies applied to an individual, which is not optimal. And so it wouldn't surprise me within the next 5 to 10 years that you're going to come into the office, they'll do this analysis, and they'll say, this drug is going to be what's going to work for your blood pressure or your diabetes problem, and this one isn't. So we reduce side effect profiles, and we enhance efficacy for drugs. The risks that we broke down from the health standpoint are not at all out of what we know. The biggie is going to be radiation, the degrading effects of lack of gravity, and we're not carrying or not taking an artificial gravity system with us. We, to this day, don't even know what dose of gravity and for what duration would be a benefit for the various degrading effects that we encounter. We talked about some of these today in the capstone projects, the bone and muscle loss, about 1% to 2% per month. And it hasn't plateaued in the durations that we've studied. We know that isolated and confined environments can create psychological problems, and there's been homicidal, suicidal, crew fights, crew and ground control conflicts, a whole bunch of other stuff. The intervehicular environment, toxic atmosphere, there's been a number of fires or combustion events on Mir, shuttle, and space station. And if you'd like, I can give you a summary list of all the bad things that have ever happened in human spaceflight. It's a huge thing. I have a poster in my office. It's about 4 by 4. And I have it available. It's been updated as of 2012. How many tools we've lost in EVAs, how many times we've torn gloves. It's a pretty cool list. Another thing that we have to contend with is spontaneous medical events. The estimate is that there's about a 7% chance per crew member per year of a medical event that would require enhanced capabilities, like you might need to go to a hospital and be in an ICU. And so obviously with a 2-person crew, you don't even have redundancy in the people there to deal with that. But I can tell you, even with a 6-person crew on the space station, there's a challenge there. So the way we try to reduce that risk is to try to understand the genetic profile that would put you in a predisposing category. Launch and entry breakup, we have launch abort system, and we have a very robust reentry system. All the fatalities that have occurred in spaceflight have occurred on launch, ascent, reentry, and landing. So from the standpoint of where we've lost crew, that's been the number one thing. And we have to deal with reentry G loads after a long period of deconditioning. So that's the generalized list. That's the kind of the top 3. Our medical teams have been broken up into 5 general categories to deal with those various risks and countermeasures. And we have the personalized medicine group, we have the radiation effects group, we have a behavioral health team, we have enabling technologies. This is some of the things that countermeasures such as exercise systems. And then the mission medical support, which is basically what we would do in mission control before, during, and after a mission and during the recovery phase. My personalized medicine team has got some of the top people in the country. Gil Oman is advisor to Obama. There's some real top-notch folks in this group. Radiation health effects team, same thing. The other teams I won't get too much into because they're more of the kind of standard of folks. Okay, so how do we do this is try to take this new emerging healthcare capability, this personalized medicine, and adapt it to the mission environment. And we'll talk a little bit about that. It's broken down. So when we talk about genetics or genomics, that's only one component. That's the gene itself, the 2-stranded DNA. There's also the transcriptomics, which deals with the RNA. There's protein, there's metagenomics and metabolomics. What we don't realize is that we carry bacteria in our system, particularly in our gut, that contribute immensely to our immune system. And we're just now starting to appreciate that the gut flora that we carry has much to do with the disease states and the immune problems that we encounter in everyday medicine. So by taking analysis tools that are available currently in all these different areas, we hope to have a better understanding. Right now, there are 10 astronauts who've flown in space that they have samples on that they're going to do analysis on the before and after their various missions to try to understand where these genetic breaks occur. What this kind of approach gives us is the ability to prescribe a drug that we have the highest likelihood of success and the lowest likelihood of adverse events. And it's something that, for certain medical conditions, particularly in cancer therapies, now this is becoming the mainstay. This is a report from the National Council on Radiation Protection about individual genetic susceptibility. So we're starting to realize now that this is a very important area in dealing with the radiation threat ahead of times. You can see various chromosome breaks. This is some analysis of chromosomes that show breaks. Like here, you see where it should be all green and it's part green and part red, where the chromosome has torn itself apart and put itself back together. And those things can result in various kinds of maladies long-term, such as cancer, accelerated degenerative effects of the vascular system, the nervous system, things like that. And those effects can occur from heavy ion particles like galactic cosmic radiation. Those are effects that we have a better understanding of with this genetic approach. And right now, like I said, we're doing this. This is an article, Personalized Medicine in Human Spaceflight, using omics-based assessment to develop individualized countermeasures. So this is now in the published literature and is being rapidly exploited in this particular program. This was data from the Mars 500 study done at Russia's Institute for Biomedical Problems. And they basically determined that there were people in the crew, the 6-person crew, that were solid players. They could adapt to the light, night, dark cycles. And what you see there, this is their sleep graph. And the 5 crew did fairly well, but this guy never adapted to that protocol. And you don't want to find that out on the way to Mars, that you can't adapt to an altered sleep-wake cycle, because that person was not functional. And we hope that the genomic analysis can yield some insight there. The #1 health threat in human spaceflight right now is increased intracranial pressure in astronauts. It is a ton of money being dumped into this problem. 70% of the astronauts on the ISS missions have had this visual impairment, increased intracranial pressure problem. They see swelling of the optic nerve head. When you look at it, they have a little camera that shows it. When they put an ultrasound, they can measure, they can see this swelling. We don't know what's going on there, but the amazing thing is, although a third of the astronauts flying on the space station are women, none of the women have gotten it. So they're protected. Is there a genetic component here? Absolutely. And we need to tease that out before we go on a 500-day mission. Radiation is a big concern. We talked about it today. Here are the sunspot cycles. Here's cycle 24. And when this would be solar max. And when solar max occurs, the number of sunspots increase, the number of ejections of coronal mass ejections that create solar particle events increase. You see them in the northern lights. You see them in power outages when it affects the power grid. But when solar max or when solar cycle is at its greatest, the galactic cosmic radiation is at its least. And the galactic cosmic radiation is the one that causes the long-term effects. It's the one that we can do the least thing about because it's virtually unshieldable. This is a slide I put in here to show the fact that even though we know that the solar cycles occur, there's a range of solar flares that might be down in this low range or very much in this high range. But this solar cycle 24, which is the one that we're currently in, is on the bottom of this scale. So right now, even though we are in solar max, we are having a relatively low amount of solar particle events, even though it's gone up from its baseline. So solar particle events are the things that we have to contend with, the most significant. We know from the Mars Curiosity, the Mars Science Lab transit, deep space transit, that we got about 2 millisieverts a day. We were talking about, what's a potential damaging event. And the amazing thing is that of the radiation that occurred on this Mars transit, which was in the kind of period of solar max, that only 5% of the serious radiation was actually from the solar particle events. Most of it's galactic cosmic radiation. So we have a number of different strategies. Obviously, these are well thought out. You want to shield. You want to understand what the crew's vulnerability is. You want real-time space weather monitoring, particularly when you're on that cycle where you're closest to the sun, and where the solar particle event that comes out, like the golden BB, if it hits you, you're in a bad state. But most of the time, it misses us. But the closer you are, the closer you have a potential for that. So we want to have good solar weather forecasting. And then if you do detect an event that's at risk of hitting the vehicle, what do you do? And some of the things that you can do are to change, and this is a habitat design considerations for solar particle radiation protection. You can go to a shielded shelter. When they were on the moon, you know what the policy was in the lunar module? everybody would get on the commander, the senior guy. They would just use their body flesh to protect them. So hopefully we'll have better options available using in situ resources. And we don't always think of in situ resources as being the things that we took with us. But we can take all the consumables and their byproducts, and we can use those consumables and byproducts, particularly if they have water mass and hydrogen, to protect us. So we're actually doing studies now where we're looking at solid waste and seeing what is its radiation shielding potential. So there is some value in shit, hopefully. I'll talk a little bit about the psychological environment. This is Valery Polyakov in one of the Mir space station looking out. He spent 5 hours a day working out, and the rest of the time looking at Earth. It's going to be a real challenge when Earth is not this big, beautiful blue dot. It is a blue dot. When you're in lunar orbit, the Earth is the size of your thumbnail at arm's length, about a half a degree or a degree. When you're in Mars, it's a pencil dot at best. But we do know from the Russian experience that there's been 8 crew members that have exceeded 500 days of cumulative time in space, and there's been 4 crew members that exceeded 1 year on a single mission duration. So can we survive the microgravity effects? Yeah, no problem. In fact, the space station crews now with the exercise protocols they're undergoing are coming back in better shape than they did when they left. We have a whole list of desirable traits. No surprise there. You don't want people that are, going to be have a likely breakdown. Medical conditions, this is pretty standard stuff. You wouldn't want to need somebody that absolutely needs to have follow-up in the period of time of the mission. Anything that would have a greater than 1% chance of occurring in a 500-day mission. This is going to be a challenge because somebody brought this up today. I don't know if the person's here, but what age of person would you take? And the key driver is that the older you are, the less vulnerable you are to radiation effects, and that's the highest concern we have. So the reality is we want an intimate couple that's older, probably past childbearing years, and potentially, not having, concerns about family members on Earth. It would be really hard. I mean, you got kids. Can you imagine being gone for 500 days? I mean, I know some POWs that survived 7 years, but it wasn't fun. But it could be done. But ordinarily, you wouldn't want to have somebody who's on their way there and now has to deal with a sick kid back home. We go through our screening process is going to have a screening in and a select in and a select out process. Altitude, exposure, high performance aircraft, preferably previous microgravity experience in either zero-G aircraft, suborbital flight, or even short duration orbital flight. Medical training, because it's a 2-person crew, they're going to have to be trained to a very high level, hopefully a level that would be, a wilderness medicine paramedic. They could take care of things. They're not going to be afraid of blood. They can do things on their own. They can manage their own conditions because it's 2 people. And if one of them is the casualty, that means you're it. So we're already developing a training protocol for this based on other extreme environments. Currently, the exercise protocol in the ISS is about 2.5 hours a day, about half of which is resistive exercise designed for bone and muscle mass maintenance, and aerobic exercise, which is designed to keep the cardiovascular function from degrading. Both of those degrade. But that's a lot of time, and it's a lot of heat that's generated. So here's the cycle ergometer, Bill MacArthur, Mike Full on the treadmill, and Ed Liu on the resistive exercise device. And all these devices have little vibration isolation units, because every time you move in space, it creates perturbations in the spacecraft. And you can actually, especially with rhythmic activities, create harmonics in the vehicle that can actually cause structural damage. Jerry Leninger was, when he was on Mir, was pissed off, and so he started literally bouncing off the walls. And the whole crew, the crew kind of had to stop him because the Mir space station was starting to wobble, you know, because one module was out of phase with the other one. And you can tell when the crew's exercising, even with vibration isolation, because you can see some of those vibrations. So some of the ideas for advanced exercise is to try to cut our exercise protocol down to as little as possible. And one of the ways of doing that now, it looks like from some of the preliminary studies, is to do high activity, high output exercises for short periods of time. You know, basically, you know, sprinting, heavy weightlifting, things like that, for very short periods of time. That may be getting us down. We have problems with breakdown of equipment. These vehicles have this vibration isolation issue. So one of the novel ideas was, and I've always thought this, you know, is about in situ resource utilization. So if you're going to work on a ergometer, the ergometer should do something for you. It should generate air currents, like you sometimes see on rowing machines. But now NASA's developed an ergometer that will start generating power. Well, you know, it's like for years, you know, you wonder, why is it that I'm getting hot, having to dissipate that heat, recover the sweat that's in the atmosphere? So the thing is, cut the time frame as short as possible, make the equipment reliable, do the most efficient exercise means, and whatever you do, whatever activity you do, get something back in return, even if it's only a 10 or 15% recovery. So these are some of the new devices that are being done. Turns out that rowing machines are some of the best exercises for aerobic cardiovascular fitness. Much better than running or ellipticals or such whatnot. So the idea is maybe we should be starting to look at this as the main means for aerobic conditioning, and then some other means like the resistive exercise that you see here for muscle and bone mass maintenance. So what we wanted to do is reduce the time, because that generates heat and carbon dioxide, which are both things that we have to contend with. Try to cut the protocol to at least half, which means instead of 2 hours a day, it's about an hour a day. And try to do devices that can give you recovery of something, whether it's electrical, ventilation, or whatnot. We have a lot of ideas on the therapeutics and diagnostics capabilities. I'll just show you some of this. You know, the new concept now is the quantified self. We're monitoring systems that can tell you before you know it that something's going on. Now, this is also being done in medicine, pushing medicine to point of care, so you don't go in to see a doctor anymore. The doctor has a sensor on you and says, hey, you've got a couple of irregular heartbeats, or your blood pressure's too high, or whatever. So these systems are becoming readily available now. You can do your EKG with your iPhone with a little attachment. We have protocols that can do diagnostic quality ultrasounds, which is the main imaging modality we use in space. We can train a ISS crew member with 2 or 3 hours to do diagnostic quality ultrasounds if they have feedback from somebody on the ground. The problem with a Mars mission is we don't have real-time feedback. But we have these protocols that give us just-in-time training, or also crew decision support capability. So you do the ultrasound and it says, okay, do this, do that, and here's what I think this reads. And we're going to start to see this in point-of-care medicine and in the military. We're going to see this in you know, a variety of other extreme environments, wilderness medicine, et cetera, et cetera. I'll just show you you can use ultrasound for hemostasis, just like you can with a ligature. By focusing the energy, it actually kind of fries it. So this is a demonstration of an arterial bleeder being controlled, coagulated with what's called high-frequency focused ultrasound. A lot of cool stuff going on. This is Peggy Whitson doing an ultrasound on her abdomen. She was very interested in the kidney function and kidney stones because that was her, she was a biochemist, and she's sitting there looking at her kidney squirt out every time the kidney puts a jet of urine into her bladder. Ultrasounds to start with, this was the size of 2 rack panels. You know, a 19-inch rack panel, that's the ATL 1000 that's used like in cardiology offices in the 80s. And now we have the GE Vivid Q, which is a laptop size, and guess what we got now? We have things that are the size of either a small tablet or PDAs. So the technology is shrinking and emerging so rapidly that hopefully by the time we do this mission, we're not going to have something like this. We're going to have something like that. These are some of the scientific projects that we've been working on. Frequency-specific lighting. You can take LED lights, which, by the way, are very low power outputs. Now, based on some of the research our institute has done, they're now putting LEDs on space station. But by using LEDs that are frequency-specific, you can wake somebody up, put them to sleep. If you've flown an Airbus 380 or a Dreamliner, they're already taking advantage of that frequency-specific lighting to modify your behavior and your sleep patterns. So that's a no-brainer. Various kinds of things, devices to give you assessments, you know, as to are you good to go, or are you kind of, is your gas tank empty? Diaries are very useful in capturing information. Wearable physiologic monitoring systems. So these are just some of the science projects. So anyway, in conclusion, this kind of the summary of my part, which is the crew health support for a mission like this, is we're adopting cutting-edge technology, which is this personalized medicine system. We're going to apply that with some of the advanced diagnostic and therapeutic capabilities that are on the emerging market. And from the crew health standpoint, I don't think we've ever been as successful or likely to succeed as we have now with some of these technologies. We still have major milestones and challenges with respect to the launch system, the transit module, keeping a life support system functioning for 500 days without major repairs. So with that, I'll end, and if you have any questions or want any more technical detail, I will bombard you with that. Thanks.
Any questions? Maybe we have other questions. Operation Mars. All right, excellent.
I do have a question. Regarding circadian rhythm, is there an optimum rhythm for astronauts that they keep them on a 24-hour cycle?
You know, these kinds of things, you have time zone changes. One of the problems that we have is every time we do a rendezvous, like with the Soyuz or Progress, we have to switch to Russian time zone, and that's about 12 hours out of sync. So they're actually what they call slam shifted, and it's horrible for the crew. They're very, very disrupted by it. And there are various reasons why that we don't give the crew optimum. In other words, the crew suffers because mission control in Moscow doesn't want to have their guys everybody switch to a different schedule. So circadian rhythms are always an issue. It turns out our circadian cycle is probably not exactly 24 hours. It's like 24 hours and 15 minutes. So it actually has a tendency to want to elongate. That's one of the reasons why we often do much better traveling from east to west, because the day is getting longer than it is going west to east, where the day is going shorter. It's that intrinsic tendency for us when we free run to extend our periods. But for the most part, the crews sleep less. They sleep maybe 6 hours instead of 8 hours. But the sleep is in some ways more restful. If any of you snore, have obstructive sleep apnea, especially when you're lying on your back, well, one thing that absolutely doesn't happen in space is you don't get obstructive sleep apnea because your tongue and your palate don't fall back on your mouth, because there's no gravity to do that. So the crews often report that they sleep really well in space. And that may be a component of that. Yeah.
What was the cost estimate for the most recent design?
Yeah, I don't even balance my checkbook. I'm not allowed to talk costs. Actually, it's a great question. And I was really intrigued by some of the analysis that you all did today. I think a lowball estimate is probably in the order of 2 to 3 billion for the absolute bare minimum, and that would require, and the way this was sold to NASA and Congress was, we would like to use systems that you're going to test. You're going to test the SLS. You're going to test the Dragon. But what we'd like to do is do that test in conjunction with this test. So, in other words, NASA's going to do a test where they're going to launch an SLS and do something. Here's a chance for them to do something with a pretty robust payload. So there has been a lot of congressional support for this. All the congressional supporters for the Space Launch System love this because this gives them a reason to exist and to push that technology development much more rapidly than would ordinarily occur. So there's a lot of support from the commercial space companies because, yeah, they'd like to do this, and we need to do something. It's always this, well, we're going to go to Mars in 20 years from now. And if you look back, that's kind of, Wernher von Braun planned to do it in the 70s. And now, it's 20 years away. We're going to go there in 2030. You guys should be fighting because you're going to be the guys going on this. Okay, thanks.
Okay, let's thank Dr. Clark again for the presentation.
Well, I'd really like to thank the students because they were inspirational for me this morning to think, wow, look at those ideas. I was writing them down, and I'm going to get copies of your talks. That was a lot of effort. And you were four-man and women teams, and the amount of work that you guys did was phenomenal considering how much we had, when we were doing our architecture study.